Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Ceres podcast with me, your host, Stelios, the founder and director of Ceres. Today, I'm really excited to have Les Howard on the show. Les is now semi-retired, but has spent his working life as a VAT consultant, focusing primarily on helping businesses, charities and churches navigate the complex world of VAT. It actually shouldn't be complex, but it is. And Les breaks down why. So you let us know your opinion later on as to why you think it is. With years of experience, Les has represented clients in disputes with HMRC, including Alternative Dispute Resolution, ADR, and Tax Tribunals. Our goal at Ceres is always to provide great products, but we also want to produce great content too. Listeners have been hounding me for ages to take a deeper dive into VAT on the podcast, so this is the start of it and hopefully it's helpful. We've written loads of articles on VAT, so obviously go find those too if you want. I'm not going to do a big bio here about Les because he actually goes into it in the episode, so if you hold your horses and fast forward a little, you'll get there anyway. Before I go on to the episode sponsor, I want to say a big congratulations to Martin Robinson, who won a pallet of natural batter mix worth about £1,300 to £1,400, that is, in last month's email competition. Remember, to be in with a chance of winning great prizes like this, you need to be on our mailing list. We're not going to put our competitions on social media because what happens is the scammers and the spammers start harassing you and copying our page. I see it happen to so many of my friends with Facebook pages, so we're just not going to do that. If you sign up to our mailing list, which is in the episode show notes, get involved, take part in the competitions, make purchases, get involved with the special offers. There's always great special offers. You could be our next big winner. Today's episode of the Ceres podcast features the revolutionary Ceres Natural Degreaser, the ultimate solution for turbocharged cleaning. This powerful, no-nonsense degreaser effortlessly tackles the toughest grease stains. Despite its natural composition, it's incredibly effective. The Natural Degreaser is a potent powdered formula designed for professional kitchens. It cuts through grease as effectively as corrosive degreasers without the harmful side effects. Our non-tainting, perfume-free, dye-free formula ensures a deep, clean and natural finish, completely neutral, performing excellently in all water conditions. It's economical, biodegradable, non-caustic, which actually makes it a safer choice for your cleaning needs and your staff. You can also dissolve the Natural Degreaser in water for a pre-soaking solution, which is perfect for stubbing stains. It removes various stains from clothing and cloths, including coffee, blood and grease. Who benefits from the Natural Degreaser? It's ideal for fish and chip shops, restaurants, hotels, street food vendors, catering establishments, you name it. It's perfect for degreasing kitchen floors, work surfaces, your walls, kitchen equipment, cookers, hoods, fryers, pots, you name it. The fact is, if you're in the food business, you need this product. It also is amazing for potato rooms when you're peeling because it gets rid of the starch and it neutralizes the potato preparation formula. So it actually has a cleaning effect on the drains too. So visit ceres.shop for free next day mainland UK delivery. We also ship to Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, all the British Isles and numerous European countries. So stay connected with Ceres and you'll find out more. Follow us on social media for the latest updates. Sign up for our mailing list so you get all the news and all the competitions directly to your inbox. Now, we're also talking a lot on these podcasts and we'd love your input too. So why not join the Ceres podcast discussion group? You can see everyone in there is quite shy. There's lots of likes, but start posting because everyone just texts me and say, oh, what do you think of this episode? Oh, what do you think of that episode? And actually, the place for it is the Ceres podcast discussion group. So don't be shy. Break the mold and start posting there. We hope you enjoyed this episode with Les Howard and be sure to send in any thoughts that you'd like us to address in the next episode. Hi, Les. Welcome to the Sarah's podcast.
Stelios, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, and thank you for making this happen. I know holidays got in the way, and mine and yours, and so it's good to finally get done. It's really weird when you talk to someone in June/July, and you're like, "Oh, let's do this in September," and I always feel like at the time that it's so far away, when in actual fact it goes so fast.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And in between, we flew off to China.
You did?
To where our son and his family live, and
was it nice?
Enjoyed some spicy Chinese food. So we stayed in Yunnan province, which is in the southwest, where the food is spicy.
Nice.
And our daughter-in-law likes spicy, so when she cooked, it was definitely spicy. But lots of meals out. And the culture there. So we stayed in a city called Dali, and people don't eat at home; they eat out almost every evening. It's so cheap. So you go out, you're in a restaurant, or more often you're in the street. Cars sometimes whizzing by a couple of meters away, and they might have a barbecue in the street, and they're cooking the food. I think they're definition of health and safety is a little different to the UK's, but the food is great. I love a bit of spice, and our older granddaughter Hannah is 8, likes barbecued meat, kebabs, that sort of meat kebabs, that sort of stuff. So she and I would share those, which was great fun. So back to slightly different diet in the UK.
These weeks, we were in Cyprus for 3 weeks, and every morning my godfather would bring fresh figs picked from the local trees.
Wow!
I'm sure they were owned by somebody, but he found them. Yes. We'd call him the fig thief, and but every day eating fresh figs. So you come to the UK, and then you open the fridge, you think, oh, like it is so different.
Yeah,
and it's just the habits are nice abroad, but you can't live like that forever, can you?
No, that's it. And yeah, I'd say the availability of fresh fruit, particularly, and the size of fresh fruit.
Yeah,
grapes imported into the UK are all the sort of uniform size and shape.
Yeah,
but grapes in a market in Dali are 2 and 3 times as big.
I've seen this everywhere. The fruit in the UK, in my opinion, is some of the worst. And I don't know what it is. And my father-in-law, he'll go on about this for days. If I ever got him on, we'd never get him off. And it's so true. I've been to Rome, the fruit's amazing. Been to Cyprus, the fruit's amazing. Been to so many countries, and you see the fruit, and then you come back to the UK, and then I hear other people say how good the fruit is abroad. Yeah. And I do wonder, have the supermarkets over here gone overboard with this whole this perfection where they'd be like, oh, well, everything's got to be a certain size and a certain colour. And I just think I think we've moved away from that. We just want natural again.
Yeah. I think that's the answer. I did a small piece of work for a major fruit importer and wholesaler, and they provided fruit for a couple of the big supermarkets. And basically they said to me, we have to make sure, say grapes, are a certain size and colour. And they would, fly out to different parts of the world, depending on the time of year, and say, look, we will only take grapes if they are like this. And that was, if the high street name insists on that, that's your livelihood. And,
yeah, absolutely.
I think he felt a bit of a shame because he said, he sort of implied that there was plenty of other good fruit around, but just couldn't be used.
Yeah.
And it is a shame. And, certainly being in different parts of China as we have, you have different local fruit.
Yeah.
You go to a different city and there's different stuff on offer. And I think we've lose that with our supermarket dominated market now.
Yeah.
And that's a shame.
Yeah.
So
we've tried to go, since we've been back off holiday, tried to go to the smaller, let's say, the old-fashioned fruiterers and the old-fashioned butchers. And the butchers is fine. I've always gone to an old-fashioned butcher's alongside, the supermarket shop. But outside, we've got a Dobby's Garden Centre, and they bring or at least someone rents a pitch there, and he's a local veg guy. And honestly, the potatoes are good, and everything seems really good. And I was saying to this someone the other day, someone said, "Oh, he's expensive," and I said, "Is he expensive, or is everybody else cheaper?"
Yeah.
And I think that's and I think with food, there's no such thing as cheaper. I think there's just different varieties at play, and you buy what you enjoy the most. And
and I suppose there is I know it's a separate topic, but there is an issue of making sure that the growers are provided for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the whole fair trade concept. And again, there's a concern that the big players, are using their power to just to control the market, right down. So that's a separate topic, isn't it?
Well, I've brought on a VAT specialist to talk about VAT, and we've started talking about fruit. So
yeah, that's right.
But
we like a bit of fruit.
No, exactly. No, absolutely. I always find it interesting that the things you learn when you're trying not to learn, when you're on holiday. And I was walking around and just observing everything. You'd see me looking at the receipt and thinking, "Oh, VAT 9%," and your brain picks up all of these things that we take for granted. Because I think in England we're so programmed to our everyday work, our usual routines. We don't look outside the box. It's tunnel vision. Whereas the minute you're on holiday, you walk 5 times slower and you're just observing everything. It's interesting how that works. But Les, thank you for your time. We haven't finished, by the way. But thank you for coming on. The reason for this, this conversation is that I've, as long as I've been in the fish and chip industry, I've been fascinated by VAT, value-added tax, for those that haven't caught up with that yet. And I think that many see it as unfair. Many see it as unjustified. Many just don't really understand it. And I wanted to, we've written probably 30 articles on value-added tax over the last 5-6 years. And really, I thought we just wanted to go talk to somebody who really understands it and start at the beginning before we can start talking about the future. It's just really understand it. So how does somebody like yourself, Les, get into, becoming a value-added tax specialist?
Well, like people say, some people are born great and others have it thrust upon them. I wasn't born a VAT officer, nor was it thrust upon me, but I stumbled into it, So I left college in the early 80s when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister. And that's a statement guaranteed to put some people on edge. But she one of the things that she did very early on was double VAT. The standard rate of VAT was 8% when she was elected, and it became 15% in her Chancellor's first budget in 1979. So one of the things she then did was build HMC&E, Customs and Excise as it was, so that there was more people to collect more VAT. Simple as that. So I was out of work when I left college, and at some point applied for the civil service in general, to discover that 80% of civil service vacancies at the time were in HMC&E. Now, it didn't mean anything to me. It was a job and I didn't have a job. So I went through the process. I vaguely remember an interview at the Civil Service Commission in Basingstoke. I can't tell you anything else about that. And they said, "Oh, by the way, we'd like you to start as an executive officer in HM Customs and Excise." And so in April 1983, I walked into what I discovered was a converted pea factory in Peterborough, which had become C&E's offices there, and joined what they called LVO, Local VAT Office. And there was about 80 staff there. I was one of, I think 2 or 3 of us were trainees, and we did a mixture of office work in different sections. We did off-site training into, obviously VAT, how accounts work, all sorts of things like that. And then gradually sent out into the field to do what's called compliance visits, can't even remember what they were called. They might have been assurance visits or something in those days. So that my caseload was typically small businesses that had just started. They were about 15 to 18 months in. So hopefully they had the first annual accounts. They had perhaps 5 or 6 VAT returns. And basically I would check those, verify them, issue assessments if there was errors, send them booklets if they were getting stuff wrong, and basically say, oh, we'll come back in 3 years and see you again or whatever. So that was the sort of start there. And I quite enjoyed that. I got my head around it. I had a supportive manager. As long as he would take me out to one of his big clients. So that was quite interesting to get into some, more crunchy, larger organisations, and just to expand my my brief, really, expand my understanding of VAT. And then just one of the sort of, so 3.5 years in, sort of out of the blue phone conversation, and it was a bit of a fine line in terms of proprietary, really. So someone I had visited some months before rang me up and basically said, do you want a job? And I thought, well, this is just a little bit odd. So I did check with my senior officer, and they said, well, as long as there's no wrongdoing in it, you are allowed to have a conversation. So I essentially I was headhunted by a sort of legal practice which related to the motor trade, and they did lots of civil law issues with vehicles that were faulty, and the demand that they had was that they wanted VAT support. So the MD had met me and said, well, why don't you come and do our VAT support for all our hundreds of motor dealers? So I thought, yeah, I quite like that opportunity. So I did that and was there for over 7 years. So I wrote a VAT manual for the motor trade. I would field telephone inquiries. I would deal with HMRC investigations. And in fact, in that period, I became a bit of a specialist, obviously, in the motor trade. That's almost all we were doing. There was 1 or 2 other businesses that sort of contacted us. And then I suppose, just going back in my brain, end of 1993, I thought, I enjoy this, but I'd just like to be a little broader in what I do and who I work with. So I decided, and again with the agreement of the MD, I said, I'd like to go freelance. I'll carry on working for you under a sort of a arm's length contract, but I fancy just doing a bit of that in my own name. A bit of a scary step, sort of leaving a small business that had 12 employees to becoming the sole practitioner. And in those days, there wasn't, as far as I can tell, there wasn't the great support for small businesses. I don't remember things like Chamber of Commerce, Business Link, that sort of support that came along later. So it's a bit
that came after the 2000s, didn't it? Really?
Yeah. So you sort of muddled your way through. One of the things I discovered quite quickly is if I talked to accountants, I could get their business. So I would write to all the small accountants locally and say, look, I'm a VAT specialist. Do you want someone to look after your clients for you? And bit by bit, 1 or 2 said, oh, yeah, come and see us. So I actually started a telephone advisory service, basically for local accountants in the Cambridgeshire area. So they paid so much a month, and so they got free phone calls. And then, say, 1 call in 10 would then lead to a bit of a fee earner, a bit of correspondence, a bit of, more detailed advice for the client. So that was a model that sort of I stumbled into, and I know a lot of firms do it nowadays. And it seemed to work. One of the things it did was get me a lot of expertise quite quickly, because I might have 10 phone calls on afternoons. Accountants always rang in the afternoon. They did clients' work in the morning. So I'd never talked to them before that. It was a really odd thing. So the afternoon was often quite busy with phone calls, but I was reading and learning all sorts of stuff. So that was a really good practical education there. And then I suppose after a while, I just started to get inquiries from charities and other non-profits. And I thought, actually, I like doing this. I like working with businesses, and people do all sorts of things you'd never dream of, and that's always interesting. But then to work with charities and say, actually, I'm doing something which is indirectly helping their clients. I thought, yeah, actually, I prefer that. So I didn't sort of write to all my commercial clients and cut them off or anything, but it was just a move in those later years. So certainly in the last 10 years or so, I spent a lot more time alongside different charitable organisations, some quite high street names, many are smaller local or regional charities. And the VAT minefield or the VAT maze looks a little different if you're a charity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Compared to if you're a commercial organisation. And the sort of unfairness and injustice that many would feel is probably felt more widely in the charitable sector. They incur a lot of VAT that they can't recover. It's been a big current issue. So most of you will have heard this about private schools paying VAT. And that's there's a perceived injustice in that. But there was already an injustice because they couldn't recover VAT on their new £10 million science block with all the kit there. They suffered the VAT of that for years.
So it's fair to say that that's actually a correction, that although there's a lot of outrage and upset, that actually private schools should be VAT rate or VAT rated, VATable as such. Is that right?
Well, I don't know. It's a correction. It's complicated because the reasons behind it are probably political rather than economic. But yeah, I mean, one of the things is that they've got charitable tax relief, because even if they're very profitable, they're usually charities. And that's where, straying a little into politics, those on the left would say that seems unfair, that organisations that make healthy profits are free of tax.
But many charities, and this is like, in my opinion, like many charities that we see on the high street, they are also businesses, aren't they? I know that. Yeah. So again, like, where do you draw the line? Where do you sort of make it black and white? Because there is a whole lot of grey area.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, the Charity Commission obviously is the organisation that tries to draw the line. And in principle, it allows a modest amount of trading that it says you can carry on within your charitable activities. But they then draw a line and say, look, if you're going to do substantial trading, and broadly over the VAT registration threshold is the line, then you can't do that through your charity. And then they would set up a trading subsidiary. So, for instance, all your high street charity shops are run through trading subsidiaries.
Oh, I see.
And they covenant profits back, which is for direct tax purposes. So there's a corporation tax issue in there. The sale of donated goods by a subsidiary of a charity is zero rated. So they don't pay VAT if they sell, the goods you buy in the shop. So there's a whole VAT thing there. And in fact, one of the jobs on my desk is a local network of charities and charity shops, just to walk them through that. But it's a whole set of other VAT complications. And from my point of view, interesting topics, and just, appropriate planning to help them. I don't do dubious schemes. I try and have a high level of integrity. That's always been the way I've operated. To operate.
There is a lot of obviously, especially if we can move away from charity for a moment. There is a lot of commercial enterprises that have a lot of money to put behind solicitors or advisors like yourself to say, go and try get us, reduce VAT. So, for example, did you see the case not so long ago? Subway went to court in the Republic of Ireland, and they were trying to get I think the Republic of Ireland was saying that their product should be VAT rated, and they were saying no, it shouldn't. And it turns out that actually their bread has more sugar than cake. So they said technically that should be VAT rated because it's got a lot of sugar in it.
Yeah.
So and then I think years ago there was Domino's. Domino's were trying to say that the sauce that was in the meal should be 0 rated, and all these little loopholes that everyone's trying to gauge for themselves.
Yeah, and there always have been. You know,
which sort of tells me that there's a theme emerging here, that many of these companies wouldn't actually drop the price. They'd probably just keep that extra money for themselves, wouldn't
they? The studies have shown that, yes, if any VAT benefit that a commercial organisation gets is its benefit, it rarely passes it on to
consumers.
Now, anybody listening who said, no, we actually pass it on, please forgive us. But the studies have shown from certainly the big players that they tend to simply increase profits and shareholder dividends.
Yeah, even recently I saw it with the tampon tax or whatever it was. And essentially, I've read two sides of this. So they're saying that it did get passed down, but the likes of Boots and the supermarkets swallowed at the margin. Either way, someone swallowed at the margin and the consumer's no better off. So, you know.
Yeah. It's always happened when the UK left the EU, which is 3 and a bit years ago. I can't remember.
Give or take.
The finance secretary to the Treasury was inundated with requests from different trade bodies to change the VAT rule on their thing. And basically, she put out a statement that said, "We'd love to help everybody." But basically, we would be losing half of our VAT revenue overnight if we helped all of you.
Yeah.
It was just not doable.
I saw a recent article. I think it was Dan Needell, and they were talking about dropping. Well, no, there's a campaign to drop VAT on sun cream. And again, the same thing came in. It says, actually, if you want to help people get it cheaper or whatever, it's cheaper to actually give it to the lowest income people in the UK rather than actually dropping the VAT element on it.
Yeah.
And they're saying the reason why they want to drop the VAT element is not because they want to sell more to people at a lower price. It's so they can sell the same amount to people for the same price.
Yes.
Yeah. So it always makes me you've always got to look at the broader picture, haven't you, of what's actually
So and just as an aside, there is a perception that tax is a bad thing, and that I don't think that helps, because tax is a good thing, because tax means that when you and I have an accident, an ambulance turns up, takes us to some highly specialist and well-trained people to put us back together again, and we don't get a bill for that.
Yeah.
It meant that my two boys could go to, good, ordinary schools in the local area, and my bins are collected or whatever. So, I appreciate there are things that we don't like what the government does, but there are lots of things that are just important. And, most countries of the world like the way the UK operates and wish they could do the same. The US love our NHS, but then our tax pays for that. But that's a slightly
I think that it's a common theme that some places that have lower tax wish they also had the services that we have.
Yeah,
and so I was talking to a business rate specialist, and he says whenever they help countries abroad with real low tax and very low property tax, the first thing they tell them to do is implement a property tax or property rate tax, a rateable back, because they said it's very hard to wiggle out of. And they said, and there is always a lot of loud voices, because it's one of the only taxes that is almost impossible not to pay. If you've got property, you're paying tax on it. So all of this is all up for change anyway at some point.
Yes.
Not completely, of course, but all up for change. So how does, and I'm not suggesting anything about your age here, Les, but how does VAT come about in the UK?
Okay. So this is a bit of a very brief recent history lesson for you, because obviously VAT arrived in the UK on April Fool's Day 1973, but
Pertinent.
really that isn't the start of the story. And actually, to help us understand why VAT, especially for food, is, as anomalous as it is today, we have to go back to the Second World War. And what happened was that the Chancellor was said at the time, you'd obviously appreciate in wartime, any economy is just totally wrecked. And expenditure is massively changed. And obviously expenditure on armaments takes precedence over all sorts of other things. So one of the things they did was introduce a purchase tax on, all sorts of things, retail sales, so as to fund, at least in part, the cost of the war. That was the sort of basic logic. And one of the things they did was that they applied it. Obviously, they applied it to lots of goods like televisions and radios and all sorts of things, but they applied it to food, but they made a distinction between non-luxury food, which was exempt from tax, and luxury food, which bore tax. And that distinction you still hear today. If I have a conversation around the table with some, franchisees of a high street, food chain, they'll use that terminology, and that's where that came from. So that was implemented essentially in the 1940s. And as I say, that was basically to fund the war effort, albeit slightly retrospectively. Then what happened, we started to negotiate with, it was called the European Commission, or the Common Market, not the European Union in those days. The negotiation had happened from the late 60s from memory. And obviously one of the requirements when we joined what is now the EU was that we would have VAT in the format that they had. The idea was that there's a standardized indirect tax. So the 1972 Finance Act was the legislation that introduced VAT. And so Group 1, and it's still Group 1 nowadays of the VAT Act, Group 1 was on food. And it was a bit of lazy drafting. And interestingly, I spoke to a legal drafts lady yesterday, as it happens. And we talked about lazy drafting of legislation. And it was a bit lazy of the government at the time to say, look, rather than look at what other EU countries were doing, and there were 6, I think, at the time, the UK government said, look, we've already got our purchase tax. Let's just cut and paste. And essentially, the VAT legislation that you and I access today in 2024 is the legislation that was cut and paste from late 1940s legislation into the Finance Act 1972. And looking in sort of over decades, that is one of the reasons why there's certain anomalies, why you pay VAT on Walker's crisps but not Doritos.
Yeah.
Because somewhere
maize and potato
in that distinction between luxury and non-luxury, that's where those products fall. And yeah, so that put a factor into the legislation, and therefore the way any food or catering retailer operates, that is simply going to create an anomaly. And of course, the anomalies we see today couldn't have been predicted in 1972. Life has moved on. Products are on our shelves that were not even contemplated. And we still have Bourbons and custard creams and Kit Kats. But a lot of products, nobody even dreamed of those. So the legislation, just couldn't apply. So, and of course, that's created all sorts of litigation over the years with Jaffa cakes,
that's a good one,
marshmallows, and all these sorts of things. But all of those pieces of litigation really come from that cut and paste exercise.
So if someone had done their job right back then, it probably would have saved a lot of hassle moving forward.
I think so.
Yeah,
and I think I did put a thing on my LinkedIn account a while ago, suggesting to Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, that she really relook at Group 1 and ask a different question. Luxury and non-luxury foods is an irrelevant thing. What about, and we've mentioned already, sugar content, salt content, health benefits or whatever, to have a different criteria to determine what bears different rates of tax. There is that to some extent. There's a sugar drinks levy and stuff like that. But for me, the logic would be, let's put it in the VAT Act. Let's draw really strong lines so that manufacturers and retailers and wholesalers know what to do. And also, if it helps, our country stay healthy, which has to be a motivation, then that's part of that. The extent to which taxation improves or protects people's health is a separate debate.
Yeah. Do you think there's the appetite there, though? Like, the last government showed no real appetite to relook at all of this. The one before that didn't. This one probably won't either. I'm just sort of guessing. I'm not trying to be a pessimist. I just think they'll probably say we've got a lot more bigger things to deal with, which, in fairness, though, if you can correct something like this, if you could go through all of these anomalies, because it's not just VAT, they exist everywhere.
That's right.
And they've got the mandate to do it. You think they've got the power to do it now whilst you've got it. I just see it as, I almost see it as they think VAT keeps working. It causes them no real headache. They get sued every now and then by a big company. They fight it. It's not a problem. Yeah. But for the most part, 99% of the time, it works swimmingly. The people that pay it don't know anything about it. The people that collect it are up in arms but can't do anything about it. So they just carry on. It means nothing. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about whilst I was putting this together was, is the word value-added tax wrong? Does it exist now? Like, is it the wrong word for what the tax actually is? And if it is, it won't be the first time, I guess.
So, I think you're right. Governments have fiddled with that. They've been too afraid to say, look, let's do more of a root and branch reform. The benefits are not immediate, and the effort is quite considerable. And governments don't like those. Civil servants don't like those things. The current pressure in our country is we want to see a change, certainly by next week, if not by last week. And that's quite difficult with changing tax, certainly in any substantial way. If I was closer to the government, obviously a long way away from it, I was close. I said, look, why don't we plan over, you're expecting 10 years in government minimum. Why don't we plan a VAT review and a VAT reform, prioritise it? What are the biggest issues within VAT? Food, construction, for instance, imports, exports, perhaps some of the fraud areas. So look, let's hit those earlier, and then let's work through the other issues. And let's create something that won't just work for the 2020s, but will still be applicable in the 2060s.
Yeah.
So that's how I would do it, and say to the government, plan for the future. Interestingly, come from China. Obviously, you don't have free and fair elections like we do, but they're planning for 50 years. They don't plan for 5 years. Everything is for 50 years.
Yeah,
and it affects how that works. Now, obviously we've got certain concerns about the way the Chinese operate their country, but there's a lot of efficiencies there.
I guess you could argue the British did that in the 1800s, I'd imagine.
Yeah. So, certainly before the modern sort of post World War II era, where everything tends to be short term. So I think I would. I would try and put in some sort of reform. So look, we've got all these anomalies. How do we draw a line that mean these anomalies don't keep cropping up?
Yeah. I think one of the things that the government has got on their side, and I don't know, I read an article years ago that said that it was the European Union that made us do it. But I'm not 100% sure on the veracity of that. But I think that one of the things they've got on their side is the fact that VAT is inclusive. If it was exclusive, so if you went to buy a car and it said £12,000 plus VAT, like a business does, but this for everybody, like I don't, every purchase that has VAT. If it was exclusive, I think people would kick up a stink more, like they do in America with their state sales taxes. And I think the government hide behind that because they know that, they can put it up from 18% to 20%, let's say, for argument's sake, and 17.5% to 20%, which was a few years back now. But who's going to kick up a stink if it goes up to 22% under Labour, let's say, because they've got, I'm speculating completely, by the way, if anyone's listening to this, but if it went up to 22% because they've got to pay some big things off, because we know there's a lot of headwinds, I think people will moan a little bit, but I don't think it's only business people that understand what VAT is. So I think for the most part, no one's really seeing it on, a biscuit that's covered in chocolate. They're just not seeing it. It's just not on their radar. So I do think it's a bit of a lazy tax for the government. And like you said earlier, I think, if they're not going to be thanked for it and there isn't immediate result, why would they do it? It's a bit like business rates, isn't it? Again.
Yeah. So there's a piece of legislation called the Price Marking Order. And I don't know the origins of it, but it's the piece of legislation that essentially requires a retailer to show prices at VAT inclusive, because the expectation is that their customers would not recover the VAT. However, if you go to a wholesale business, so you go to a builder's merchants, which is essentially trade only, you would expect them to put net prices, as long as there was a sign that says our prices are net.
Yeah.
So it's the price marking order which sort of oversees and directs how businesses are to operate in their sector. So the same would apply on a website. So you go on, a major website that used to sell books only and now sells everything, and the price is the price. And if there's a VAT query, there are pages behind the scenes that tell you about it. But I mean, the logic is that if you see a price that says £9.99, that is what you pay.
Yeah.
And you're leaving the seller to sort out the VAT. Which brings me back to this phrase value-added tax. Because one of the logics of value-added tax, and it was invented by a French economist, I'm sure someone told me in the 1950s, where in a chain of supply, each person adds value. And when you look at the input and the output for that person, the tax is on the value he adds.
Oh, okay.
So that is the logic. And when I used to lecture on VAT, the people I lectured for, they produced this really clever matrix that showed how that worked using, the ubiquitous widget as it went through the supply chain, and how each stage added value and the VAT worked. And ultimately, of course, it's the retailer who pays the VAT inclusive amount, doesn't recover it. And in VAT speak, that's called sticking tax. So it's output tax, which isn't input tax in someone else's hands. And that, of course, is, when we're looking at the catering trade, one of the difficulties is, and we'll come to it in a bit of detail, is that the product through the supply chain is zero rated. So the potato from grower through to chip shop is zero rated. But once he cuts it up and puts it in his fryer and sells it as chips, it's standard rated at a single supply chain. So it's a different concept to, a computer mouse, which is standard rated right down the chain of supply.
All the way through. So
that's one of the factors that creates an anomaly, if you like, an injustice, if you like, for the certainly the catering sector with certain products. Perhaps we should wind back and talk about the EU for a minute.
Go for it.
I know. Obviously, we've now left the EU, which was interesting. Again, separate podcast. Let's not do that.
And you sort of did allude to whichever side you were on. leave or remain, whichever.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people just thought there'd be huge wholesale reform to VAT, and that obviously didn't happen. And I think that's because government don't want it to happen.
No, that's right.
So no, technically it can, but but the also thing is they just don't want it to. But so
that's right. Well, the UK's freedom. I mean, it's done one or two little things on environmental goods, so like solar panels for charities, for instance, which is a welcome thing in my view, and I've advised one or two charities on it. So we can do all sorts. But the old EU legislation, and there's a piece of legislation called the Principal VAT Directive, which is the sort of EU's equivalent of the VAT Act. And what that does, it allows member states to use a lower rate for food. So it's the equivalent of the zero rate group in the UK, but it doesn't have any provision for a zero rate. And the reality is, and I did a little bit of reading. In EU member states, the rate of VAT on food, say in supermarkets or the equivalent, typically is 5 to 10%. It's not zero rate. So when you then look at the difference between retail catering at 20%, you've got a much smaller gap in terms of the VAT payable by the customer, but also the way the retailer has to operate. For us, we've got zero rate on one hand and 20%. That's a big gap. But for a typical EU retailer, it's from 5 or 10% up to 20%, and it's a big difference. It makes, to my mind, a comparable retailer in a much happier position.
Yeah, because I guess, let's just use France as an example. If a restaurant is at 12% VAT that they have to charge or collect, which is interchangeable in that respect, and then they're also buying fruit and vegetables and chicken and pork, and let's say that's at 5%, they can claim that back.
Yeah.
Whereas in the UK, they're charging or collecting 20% from Joe Blogs.
Yeah.
But most of their inputs, if not all of them, all food inputs are zero rated, which means it's a full 20%.
Absolutely, yeah. So, which is correct. So if I pay, £20 for a meal, in the UK, there's a big chunk, 1/6 of that.
Yeah.
So it's VAT that goes to government. So the equivalent, So the equivalent in France, we say 5% to 12%, so that's 1/14. So that's less than half.
But I guess, so from a business point of view, you can see how that's really attractive. That I can see how food hospitality businesses or takeaway businesses in the UK are jealous of that. I get it completely. But from an economic point of view, the fact that they don't have provisions for zero, which the UK does, it almost means that I feel that from an economic point of view, that our government would never, ever want to put VAT, even at 5%, on ingredients for food, because that would penalise every person at the supermarket.
But it's a political issue, a perception issue, because the government could get all the big retailers around the table and say, look, in the next year, this is what we're going to do. Everything's going to be 5%. Can we have a gentleman's agreement that for 2 years you'll absorb half that, or something like that? They're just getting mobile phone people around the table this week because of thefts of phones. They're getting ticket sellers around the table because of abuse of the Oasis tickets.
One thing I find with government, both actually, I was going to say mostly Labour, but actually it's not really. But they all talk a good game. These sort of meetings will do nothing. The only way you're going to stop phones from being stolen is if you actually block them immediately, so no one can ever use them again. And make sure that they have zero value, because you make it highly illegal if people buy them. And then actually arrest the people that did it. And I think I'm probably a bit harsher in that respect. Whereas getting all the 5 or 6 phone companies together to sit down to make it look like we're doing something, means that fast forward a year, 2 years down the line, I guarantee you nothing's changed. And
Yeah.
that's just me being a cynic, I guess. And I think same with this whole Oasis thing. Or no, it's not just Oasis, but it's ticket sellers. Obviously, they're using the Oasis thing as the conversation point. But I think for me, it's like nothing will change. I think if I put a reminder in our calendar to have a chat about this in 2 years' time, I'd almost guarantee that nothing's happening. I think I read a story the other day, and it said that to combat child poverty, the government is now going to stop any new food takeaway businesses to open next to schools. And I was like, well, you know what? Here's how you fix that: stop kids from leaving school. And make sure they're fed at home so they're not hungry. Yeah. And I think, but again, it's become it's everyone else's problem. And I think sometimes governments do this thing where they say we're going to have a special meeting. It's like a Cobra meeting for everything now. It's like, whereas before it was just Cobra meeting for like terrorism or whatever. Now it's like, no, we've got to be careful because we can't have another Greg's on the high street. So,
and there is that, the government wants to be seen to appear to do something, even though the thing they do may not be
worth doing.
So the cynic cynicism, and I've seen governments of both colours, do that down the years. And,
I think for me, I'd probably much prefer, like, rather than say we're doing something, or at least we're having a meeting about something, I'd rather that they just did it. Like you said, plan VAT changes. We're here for 10 years. We're here for 4 years or 5 years. We're going to do one change every quarter. It's only little, but you're going to see big progress at the end. And I think this is where governments limit themselves, because they literally say, we're going to do big things only. And you think, well, actually, what if you did lots of small things instead?
Yeah. And some of those small changes incrementally are those things that make a real difference. And I mean, again, and both parties are true of this, that they're quite broad, so they each have their left and right wings, which again have their different, whatever decision they take, potentially they criticise from both sides, and that's within their own party.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then of course, the media is always saying the things the media says, and that can be a distraction. I can understand the logic of China. So there's effectively there's no media to criticise what's going on, and so they do what they like.
Well, it's great if all you want to do is good things. Like if your plan is to only do amazing things, then all of who needs media that gets in the way and people's opinions.
Right.
But when you want to chop down someone's house because you want to build a 6-lane motorway,
that's right. Yeah.
And also, someone said to me today, "Did you know China build X amount of motorways there?" And I was like, "Well, that's fine if they've got their compulsory purchase is literally that. It is, we're taking this off you, and if you don't like it, go somewher else, or we'll build one a lane on either side of your house." And I think in the UK, like, because they're using HS2 as an example, and they were saying, "Oh, we can't do anything over here," and I sort of understand that sentiment, because everything we've got to research it, then we've got to have meetings, then we've got to have town hall meetings, we've got to, and then the compulsory purchase means that we have to buy it at a higher rate, which is great for people that had a house in that area, and then everyone says, "Oh, we can't do anything under budget." Well, because everything takes longer, and we've got a democracy, I guess. So
it is, it sort of swings and roundabouts thing. Our son has lived in China for several years, and obviously we can freely discuss stuff, with him, and it's there's a point to which it works.
Yeah.
But if you're either individually or your organisation wants something different, you just don't get it.
No.
There's no opportunity to sit down with someone and say, "Look, can we have a conversation about this?"
Yeah.
So, for instance, near us, the Cambridge Busway, which runs to St Ives, where I live, there have been 3 deaths in the last few years, as people falling onto the tracks and being killed. So, a small local pressure group says, "Look, we really need better safety, because otherwise these deaths recur." And so there's now been safety fences put up. And so a small local organisation has it's possible for them to make a change that benefits people's lives. And but that process probably isn't possible in China in quite the same way.
No, I imagine it's not.
But it's what it is.
No, exactly. Look, it's horses for courses, isn't it?
Yeah,
So, in your mind, do you think if you could pick either system for the UK, do you stick with the system we've got, or do you go to the European system, which is no zero rate, 5% on lots of things, and also 12% and so on, and 20%, or do you stick with the 0% on some things, and then obviously 20% on hospitality and services?
Yeah, I actually prefer the European model. There's a bit more consistency, and certainly when I've been involved in cases or read cases where the UK Tribunal or the EU Court of Justice has looked at the sort of distinctions, you think, well, there's actually a bit of logic there, which is okay. It's perhaps a little removed from the pressure group mentality thing, lobby group thing that we have here. But it seems to produce something that works a bit better, seems to minimize the anomalies and the unfairnesses that our system tends to do. Ours is, if you said this is our VAT system today in September 2024, no one would invent it.
No.
Like this. You would invent it entirely differently. And I think that's partly because it's, of all this history.
Yeah.
And all these anomalies and these variations. And, there was one on Yorkshire Agricultural Society. They do their sort of annual event. Should you pay VAT on an event? What's it? It's to do with the way it's promoted for charitable purposes and what are the aims and objectives. And it turned on essentially the wording on the ticket. And, is there 20% or exempt because of a strap line? And Customs argued the size of the font on a ticket. And that's going up to the Court of Appeal. And you think, that shouldn't be necessary, in my view. And I don't think that would happen in the EU. So, there are little sort of nuances there.
I think it just becomes a bit of a joke when, for example, if you're looking at it broadly, if you're outside the UK, let's say you're an accountant in Spain and you think, I want to do some research on VAT in the UK, and you think peanuts at the supermarket that are unshelled have no VAT.
Yeah.
No, sorry. Yeah, have no VAT, but then shelled ones have VAT.
Yeah.
Chocolate that you eat has VAT, but chocolate that you cook with has no VAT. If you go to a takeaway and you buy a slice of bread with no butter on it, there's no VAT. But if you then wanted butter on it, there's VAT. Yeah. Like these are endless. I think biscuits with no chocolate on, no VAT, and then with chocolate on, VAT. And you just think, you're right. If someone invented this today, you'd be laughed out of the room. Yeah, like imagine the newspaper. They'd have an absolute field day, wouldn't they?
Yeah. And the marshmallows thing came up last year with Morrison's. Because they're big marshmallows, you're going to stick a stick through it and put it on your barbecue. It's 0 rated. But if you have a little packet of them, you eat on the way home from school. You shouldn't, but you do. That's standard rated because it's confectionery. Okay. So we just make our marshmallows bigger and we say VAT. It's madness. But then if they're smaller and they're cake decorations, they're 0 rated again. So, it's
I think one of the issues that the fish and chip shop industry, and I think it's with reason to some degree, get really peed off is the Greggs issue, or Greggs or Baker's issue. And the fact that anything that's not being kept hot on purpose, anything that's not, when I say on purpose, you're not only keeping it hot, but it's not packaged to stay hot. And then the fact that there's no, LEDs, it's meant to be consumed ambient or at least cool. Yeah. And fish and chip shops probably say, and other hot food businesses say, 1 minute, we do make food that's intended to be eaten hot, but how can that be 0 rated and we're 20%? And I think if we did have a more of a European model, you could probably argue that we could be, for argument's sake, 12.5%. I'm just making it up, and that Greggs could be 5%. Because and at least then that would differentiate, and it's not a huge difference.
Yeah.
But obviously, the British model means that we can't do that, or at least no one's listening to enable that. I think. What do you think of the idea that, in some sense, that all of out of home food just becomes vatable?
I think there's merit in having a simpler approach, and one of the subway issues, which relates to that, is am I going to have a cold sub, and then if I take it away it's 0.80, but if I eat it in the store it's standard, and then the person on the till has to ask me that, and I have to give him the right answer. So it's creating a whole set of problems which could be resolved by saying, if you are a retail, somehow you've got to define it in some way, but a retail caterer with a substantial mix of eat-in and takeaway, then there is a sort of flat VAT rate, 12.5% or 15% or something, because then there's a fairer thing. And certainly Subway franchisees have said to me, well, we're already at disadvantage with Greggs, let's even it. So again, you'd have something that's more simple, more straightforward for all parties, less liable to error, which obviously is part of the problem, because the person asking, are you going to have this in the store or take it away, is not a trained accountant. They're a person on the till on not far off minimum wage. They're trained to prepare your sandwich.
Yeah, that's it.
They're not really trained to understand the reason for that question. Now, I know the reason for the question.
Yeah.
And actually, if I take it away, it's no cheaper. They just don't pay VAT in the price. So which is a separate
I
question.
think what we've probably seen a lot of these chains do half hot and half cold, let's say Subway is an example.
Yeah.
I think all the sandwiches are probably priced to factor in hot anyway.
Yeah.
And that's what they're really doing. It's like how some places, a lot of the cold drinks have now become, they've all got essentially a sugar tax. They're all the same price, but the ones without sugar that obviously make more profit for them. So, but one thing what I quite liked about when when Subway was trying to take HMRC to court, obviously, because that's how you do that.
Yeah.
They said that they only warm up the bread so it's technically crunchy, not to be hot. And I thought, that's a good try, but the HMRC didn't fall for that one. But I was in a Greggs. I go to Greggs probably once a week because my son does jiu-jitsu, so I'm always just there either on my computer waiting for him to finish. I'll grab him a little something from there. And I remember once I just said, can I have a pizza slice? And I don't mind you warming it up, and I don't mind paying the VAT. And the woman goes, or the young girl goes, I don't know what that is, she goes, but I can't. I've been told by my area manager that I cannot warm it up. And I says, why is that then? And she goes, I don't know, it's some sort of clerical issue or admin issue. I'm not allowed to, but I'm just not allowed to warm it up. And I was like, and I knew that it was because it just creates a whole lot of headache for them. And I think, but I do think for the most part, as much as fish and chip shops dislike it, Greggs are following the letter of the law. They've got rid of all the heated lamps. All their packaging is just greaseproof paper. It's not, none of it's meant to retain the heat. And now they're very big at selling hot food as well. And that it carries all VAT as well. So I do think they are following. But I think business like Greggs, like Subway, would all like, I would imagine, one VAT line. I think then everyone can play by the rules and just, do what they got to do. But whether it ever come, I just don't know, if I'm honest. But it is interesting because even within the hot food takeaway business, whether it's cold food, hot food, desserts, everything's moving towards aggregators and digital. If they could clean up the VAT side, I think that would really make things better for everybody. I think
certainly would make it much easier.
Absolutely. What's your thoughts on this whole making tax digital? Like, it's been slow to implement, and I think it started off, I can't remember years it's been, because they were phasing it in, weren't they? But do we ever see a day where it's just on everything, on every part of the supply chain?
I mean, that's the goal. That's the stated goal. And part of the logic is HMRC keeping an eye on everyone. So the guy can sit at his desk, log into your system, and check your VAT return. That's part of the logic. It's not to do with you; it's to do with them. And for instance, for years, HMRC had all the data on all Just Eat transactions in the UK.
Wow.
And all they needed was enough people to monitor this data and check it. And they have done it periodically. Because once you've got the data accessible by the revenue authority, you've got the possibility then of checking the taxpayers' returns, in theory without their knowledge. You might add to courtesy say, we're looking at your return today. And also, obviously, if there are errors, to spot that. But, to have things digital in the cloud, there's lots of reasons why that's a good idea, as long as it works. So, I talked to somebody today and they're changing their accounting from Xero to Sage. And the concern there is, if I wanted to find out what happened the day before they converted, can I access that data? And actually, there's an industry that transfers data between software and software. And does all that work? Because sometimes I've come across situations where I cannot get at that data. Mm-hmm. And HMRC, therefore, also cannot get at the data. So there's certain technical issues there. But I think there's a logic moving away from paper everything. Because, if everything is in a book and paper, it can get, burned in a fire, it can water leak, destroys it. So if you want to drill down into what's actually happened, you can't do that. But if everything is, in the cloud, as we say, digitally available to the auditors, to HMRC, to other, regulatory authorities, there's a logic to that. It should be less capable of manipulation, but I do know that there are those out there that can manipulate it. But that's the theory.
Well, there was an investigation or something that got concluded where they found lots of EPOS system suppliers that have done suppression software. Yeah. And I guess where there's risk, there's reward, and there's all So this is always. I know they always say, so when they bring out a new banknote and they say this one won't be able to be counterfeited, and it's only a year down the line, and it's like, oh yes, it can. So I think technology moves for everybody. It doesn't stay.
That's right.
I think one of the interesting things is that I think when someone says to us, "Oh, well, making tax digital means that there'll be no mistakes or theft," I think I don't think that exists, because I think
it's naive.
It's very naive to think like that. I think 2 years down the line, technology's caught up, and there's going to be some sort of suppression somewhere, or even mistakes also happen online too. And
that's right. Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things in our notes was, you mentioned that the 90k threshold puts people into VAT. Was your concern that it brings people into VAT collecting and paying too early or too late?
Too late. So again, it's an interesting thing within the EU. I mean, most EU member states effectively have no VAT registration threshold. So if you're in business, you get registered for VAT. Whereas here we've got a lot of small businesses are not registered because they are under the threshold. And interestingly, and there's data on this, when they push the threshold up, the income of certain businesses follows it, but stays just below it. And there's a bunching of data, and Companies House, etc., HMRC have the data on that. And the higher you push the threshold, and obviously it's gone up, ahead of inflation usually, I mean, more recently less so, it creates this fiscal cliff, by which I mean that once you then go over, and particularly, talk about retail caterer in particular, all of a sudden his income, in the last year was 80,000, he doesn't pay that. If he goes to 90,000, all of a sudden, he's got to find £15,000 of VAT, and that's off his bottom line. And because there's no input tax on his purchases, there's no VAT to offset. So the combination of the zero rate, the high standard rate, and this high registration threshold creates a particular problem for a retail caterer.
Do you think that... Go on, sorry, finish your...
I'd say that isn't true if you were, say, you're a retailer of greetings cards. Because your value added tax is the VAT on your profit, and you bought at standard and you sold at standard. So the net VAT is comparatively smaller. So if you go over from 80,000 to 90,000, okay, there may be a cost, but it's much, much lower. It might only be 1 or 2,000. And if you generated more sales, you've got more profit. So the impact, and then equally the impact on a wholesaler of plumbing materials, for instance, almost no impact on them by going over the threshold. So that threshold has a particular impact on... There's a phrase the EU uses, which is called labour-intensive services. So they would refer also to hairdressers. So anybody in the sort of beauty sector where the cost of materials is low compared to the cost of services that relate to it. And therefore the VAT effect of becoming registered is significant. And actually the EU has a lower rate for labour-intensive services, which countries can opt into. And the UK government never did, interestingly, whereas it could have done.
Which basically confirms to me they've got no intention of ever doing so.
Yeah, because it's well, it would just be helpful.
I get that, but they're making it from hospitality, and I was just writing notes from hospitalities and food retail business. They're making a true 20%.
Yeah,
so they've got no, and again, customers of fish and chip shops and hot sandwich shops and coffee shops are not kicking their door down to say this is a huge injustice.
Yeah.
Coffee sales are through the roof. Hot coffee sales are through the roof. Yeah. I'm one of those people that buy coffee. And you think no one's screaming to HMRC or the government or the Treasury saying this is a joke. So, and the business owners haven't really got a voice in that respect because the government will just say, well, okay. Well,
yeah.
It's just...
And I'm sure they make a good margin, £3.50 for a
coffee.
coffee.
I'm sure they do. But you can't argue that the VAT on coffee is probably more than their whole stock. I'm convinced it's worth more than the water and milk, even the cup, the beans. Yeah. Maybe not so much the labour added in, but VAT is, especially labour in the UK now, it's shifting upwards.
Yeah, that's right.
So, in my mind, the whole threshold, the threshold exists from what I've been told, because it means that like market traders or small sellers don't need to register for VAT to sell small amounts of things. Let's say, and if that's true, then is it time to just say that everyone pays or collects and passes on VAT in these businesses from day one, but that we haven't got the cliff edge, but it's a lower VAT rate or something,
Yeah, I would, either abolish the VAT threshold or make it very low and say, look, if you're a business, just get registered. Because if there was a consistent approach to making tax digital that applied to VAT and income tax and corporations, it's much easier. So the record keeping requirements would be the same. So, you just say, okay, I've got an app on the phone, which a lot of people have their accounts and they access it on the phone as well as their laptop, and as well, if you had a single return, for instance, provisional interim quarterly return for VAT, income tax, everything else, and then a full annual return. For me, that's logical. It's easy. It's obvious. And so there's no reason why you should have a VAT registration threshold, because then there's no question of competition, and there's no fiscal cliff issue, and okay, arguably, because part of the argument is that customs say it's expensive to monitor small businesses, but small businesses don't need much monitoring. Well, you have a computer system when the returns go in. If the numbers don't look right, and their computer already does this. If their numbers don't look right, it's flagged for a review. You send a return in with £1 million VAT claim, you will not get the payment back in a week.
No.
It'll be red flagged and checked.
Yeah. They need to investigate all of a sudden.
Yeah. And so, again, it's thinking holistically and say, look, this is our end goal, to make it easy for our businesses, because we need our businesses to be successful. Let's make a taxation system which is uniform, which is organised. So, for instance, on costs, the rules on what is deductible for income tax are different to the rules for what is deductible for VAT. Why is that? Stupid. We should have a single clear, if this is what you spend, you can claim, both taxes, direct and indirect tax. But while we've got differences, and then it all perpetuates these, Heath Robinson.
I just think that there's not enough people within government that understand. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mean civil servants, because there's probably civil servants in those departments that understand exactly what you're talking about. But I mean, like, MPs and so on. I met an MP and I said, I discussed some of how our industry feel that 20% is an injustice. He didn't even know what I was on about. I could have been talking gibberish. I could have been talking to my wife and she thinks I was talking gibberish, to be honest. So, but he just did not really get it. He was just like, I don't really know. I'll have to go ask somebody. And you think, come on, like this. And again, I think it goes back to, if there's no benefit for them and they're not going to get a thanks, then what is the point? One of the things you mentioned earlier is that when you first started, you did assurance visits, and that was after 5 or 6 quarters. Now, I can imagine that was costly. That you're an employed person to be going out and doing that would have been costly. But I would imagine that probably cost government less in the long run, because you probably stamped out earlier mistakes, let's say, and I think now what's sort of happened is that I know a lot of people in the industry that wouldn't just pick up the phone to ask HMRC a question because they're afraid of being penalised for something, even if it's an honest mistake. And I think, whereas I think the tax code is difficult for people to follow, and they're not going to put themselves in a position where they could lose their livelihood over a mistake. So I think what they do is either carry on making that mistake, and you hope that the accountant flags it up at some point. But again, they don't know everything either. So I don't know. I just feel like now I'm not saying they should have hundreds and thousands of people working for HMRC, but, we've got AI now. And, if there's any anomalies that don't kick in, but try get AI to understand all of these different tax codes and messes, and this is why maybe that's the reason for changing these things, to make it understandable for a computer and a person whilst we're there, because there's just so many different anomalies that nobody can actually get their head around it.
But, so, I mean, on that point of the first visit, we had there was records of how much money we raised, and as it happened, you stumbled across a couple of big errors and you hit your target, and I managed to do that, but. The impact on the small business that I visited, I mean, I don't know that there's data on this, but the fact that they'd been seen and I was able to answer specific questions that arose protected the revenue for the future. There's no question about that. Now, that there will be some people that, didn't want to ask me certain questions because they wanted to get away with stuff. I accept that, but there's always that. But for the genuine taxpayer, an early VAT assurance visit, I think, is value for money, irrespective of how much I generate, because I'm protecting the revenue for the future. So my personal view is that then when customers withdrew that, which they did, it's leaving people to continue to get things wrong and therefore rob the exchequer of that money. And nobody knows about it, so it's just a different perception of why you do what you do, and if the civil servant, if the VAT inspector is only there to generate income, for me that's the wrong target. Yes, he should be finding errors, and if he wasn't, one of the guys in our office wasn't very good at picking it up, so he was supported. But it's protecting the revenue for the future.
Absolutely.
It's really important.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
One of the things before we move on from threshold is that I think in the terminology it says you should register to VAT not when you reach the threshold, but when you think you're going to reach the threshold. AKA, so if you're a month into business and you've took £20,000, well, it's probably likely that you're going to reach that figure pretty soon, and that's when you should register. Have I got that right, or have I misunderstood that?
No, but again, there's a difference between what the legislation says and what is good practice for a business.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I've done over the years is meet with people setting up in business. And one of my questions to them is, look, are you expecting to do most of your business with other businesses? And they say, yeah, we're printing business, let's say. And I say, okay, get registered for VAT on day one. So you don't need to ask the question when you're reaching 85 or 90,000 or whatever, because you just spent 100k on equipment. You've got 20k to get back. Let's get it back on day one.
Yeah.
All your clients are in business. They're going to recover that. Now, if it's a chip shop, it's the same question, but the answer is different because your customers are private people. So look, okay, don't register straight away, although obviously you've got your VAT on your costs, your setup costs, unless that is particularly high. Wait till you're nearer the threshold, then we'll work out, and then choose the date on which you register. Keep it in your control rather than, wait for HMRC to come or whatever. The rules have changed over the years because there did used to be a situation where, if you looked ahead, the only look ahead rule now is when you look ahead 30 days. So if good example then actually, if you're saying, right, we've got Oasis coming on the 15th of the month and we've just sold we're expecting to sell £100,000 of tickets this week, you would have to register straight away.
Oh, I see.
So the look ahead is 30 days, not 1 year. It used to be 1 year. But again, people don't understand that. And it might, if we didn't have a threshold, we wouldn't need that tricky question. Because then there also comes an issue. What if you get near both criteria at the same time? Because one takes precedence over the other. But how would the man in the street or even the sole practitioner accountant necessarily know that? And then what are the consequences if you get it wrong, etc.? So,
I think,
for me, I suppose, I've had 30 years plus to think through all these issues.
One of the things I see now with the UK, well, not just the UK, actually, the way we transact businesses now, the way we do commerce, there's such low friction. The barrier to entry is so low that people I could set up a business today like that.
Sure.
But I do think if you're setting up a new business in a physical store, maybe if they just gave it a little bit more friction, just a teeny bit more, it's not going to slow them down too much because it's a physical store anyway. It's not an online store. And then you could say, do you understand that you're a hot food business or a food business? Let's make the system fairer. You're a food business. VAT is this. Here's your obligations, blah, blah, blah.
Sure,
Because again, there is a lot of people that go into business and don't know certain things. And then they end up getting a review, or as you call it, a compliance review a year down the line. So how do HMRC know who to visit? After a certain amount of time?
It is generated by their computers, by their artificial intelligence. And it takes a number of factors. So which trade sector, turnover, their history, whether they've got a good history of compliance, other data they have, social media data, data from Deliveroo, Just Eat, or whoever else. So they're gathering a whole load of data. But the trouble is they target it for generating revenue for assessments, not targeting it for protecting revenue. And as well, they go for soft targets. And to be fair, the retail catering trade is a soft target. It's independent businesses. It's a lot of cash. It's retail. It's high net VAT. So there's a lot of factors that means HMRC will look at these sorts of businesses. You run a newsagent store, you hardly ever get seen because it's much lower. Okay, a lot of them are independents, but the risk is perceived as much lower. So there is a thing out there. So yeah, and that's how it can. They do a lot of desk checks. They just review it. They look at the returns, look at other data, and they may just complete a assurance review without telling the taxpayer. So you might get seen and not know that you're seen.
Yeah.
Because they sign it off and move on to the next one. So even when I was in the department, there used to be a desk check thing. Used to get a pile of 10 or 20 files, because hard copy files in those days. It was always an experienced guy did it, but he would run through them, select what he deemed worth looking at from his experience.
In my preparation for this, and also lots of articles that I read, I see, HMRC has took someone to court, and it's usually such a name versus the HMRC. But what I'm emboldened by is at the bottom where it says that it almost looks like the legal team of the person that's being investigated almost throw it back to HMRC to say, you prove how much theft has happened. And I always find that quite odd, actually, because surely it's for HMRC to say to them, prove that you didn't do it as much as we think you did.
It depends exactly what route has been taken.
Okay.
And that's where it gets into a whole complex area of investigations, appeals. Is it a civil matter? Is it a criminal matter? I'm wondering whether that conversation
is another time. Yeah,
we can do another day.
I do think that's probably a good idea, because it feels like we're going to go down a rabbit hole. And
and there's a whole set of details of how those conversations were, and we can talk about appeals process. So what was I doing this time? Yesterday, I was sitting on a tax tribunal at exactly the same desk, albeit with a tie on. So there's a thing of how HMRC review, and then how you go to appeal, and direct and indirect tax is slightly different. And so there's all sorts of things, and director liability. So I think probably there's a bit of a trailer there for our next podcast.
It sounds like a lot more grey area built on top of lots of grey area.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is. Yeah. So it's already complicated. And then when there's either wrongdoing or HMRC think there's wrongdoing, there's a whole set of other complicated. So that's another...
interesting.
Dear listener, please watch out for our next podcast.
So it's interesting, but I've really enjoyed just sort of like picking apart the differences, because I've always thought to myself, in a simple term, that I've always sort of not defended, but maybe made the case for the fact that UK is 20% because we don't have the zero rate. And if we did bring, let's say, 5% to supermarket goods in the UK, British people that just do normal shopping would not be very happy. Yeah. But I see your point, which is, well, actually, it gives us a lot more ability to tweak on every level. Yeah. Because they don't have zero, but they have lots of fives and lots of sevens and lots of 12s and 9s. And I do think that actually, bar a few things that shouldn't be VAT rated at all, like zero, you could argue that bread, maybe plain pasta, you could argue that they're all zero because that is a staple. But once you start moving off non-staples, like staple foods, you can see how 5% would do nicely.
Yeah. I would look at the whole zero rate, and there's about 20 or something now. And I would say, unless there is very, very good reason, we abolish all zero rate. That would be my approach. Stick it at 5% if necessary. But I think a new house, my view would be a new house still wants to be zero rate. I would keep that.
As in a new build. Yeah.
New build, yeah. Which is obviously what it is at the moment. Because 5% makes a big difference then.
Yeah.
But, I would say to the Chancellor, unless there's a very, very good reason, and it's not just a noisy lobby group, unless there's a very, very good reason, I would get rid of zero rating. It, it's an anomaly in itself because it's taxation that generates no taxation. So why do we have it? Why do we charge? I've got a packet of Jaffa cakes. Why do they charge a tax that I'm not paying? It's okay. I won't like paying another 5%, but I'll still eat Jaffa cakes. No, I appreciate. You've got to get through a hurdle of perception. There's a political issue. There's a little, blip on inflation or whatever. I get all that. But, if we're planning 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the revenue that generates...
You say there's a blip on inflation, but if you're also dropping, takeaway food whilst we're there, and some services, let's say, because not all services should be 20%. So you could say, for me, it makes sense to actually, it could have a positive effect if done correctly, which means it probably won't be. So, but it's just, I think the problem is, we've written articles about it. You probably talk about this in your circles. I talk about it in my circles. But if there's zero political will and no consumer will, I just think that we could talk about it all day long because nobody actually cares enough to do something about it. And I think that's the real shame is that, we could send Rachel Reeves 100 letters a day. But no one really cares because everyone's sort of going off about other issues and maybe they're important to them, but you don't see anybody kicking off down the street because, there's 20% on VAT on fish and chips or cost of coffee or, or going for a meal. And I think hospitality industry would really like, eating out at, let's say, 12.5%. I'm not speaking for them. I'm just sort of broadly speaking, looking at Twitter this morning. And I think, but then I was saying to a friend of mine this morning, do you think that VAT on alcohol as part of a hospitality meal, should that also be 12.5%? And he was like, yes, because you're eating with it, which sort of made sense. And I do think we are probably behind the Europeans in the fact that we don't, I don't know, we eat out a lot, but I think that's the other thing. I was just about to say that we're behind the Europeans because they eat out a lot. But I'm trying to think. We eat out all the time in the UK. So again, it's not stopping us from eating out, is it?
That's right.
So the government could argue at 20%, nobody's stopping from doing these things.
No. And, people still have a bottle of wine and will still have a bottle of wine or, a pint of Guinness or whatever. And actually, if that was 25%, because it's alcohol, doesn't the Scottish government have an alcohol tax?
They do. They have a unit, a minimum unit tax. I can't remember. Is it 50p? I think 50p for the minimum. Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know the effects. It's not long since they've implemented it. So, it's alcohol doesn't damage lives. It's abuse of alcohol damages lives. And it's true on lots of things. But I suppose, big picture stuff, I would tend to, broadly, I would be happy with paying higher tax so that our schools didn't fall down, our hospitals didn't fall, you could get appointments. So I'm lean towards a high tax or a left wing, I suppose. And Scandinavian countries tend to do that.
But do you think that's because, and without being rude, do you think it's because you've been through it, you're a bit older, you're coming to retirement age, and you've got grandchildren, so you think of that level a bit more? Whereas, I guess younger people probably, they look at their paycheck and think, what the hell? Right? I don't know. I don't know what, I'm just trying to think,
no, it's fair.
Yeah.
And, so our son was over from China and his daughter, who was not yet one, was poorly. He turns up at the local hospital 11 o'clock at night and they don't get a bill. She gets looked after. In fact, she gets seen quickly because she's a child. And, she's cared for. They do her checks. They give her some medicine. They send her away. 2 days later, she's fine. And there's no bill.
This was over here.
Yeah. So she's not even a British citizen. And her mum is not a British citizen. But, okay, a dad is. Our son. So, I don't mind the fact that I'm paying tax that enables that to happen.
We should
So
have a
yes,
sense of pride for that, for definite. Yeah,
yeah,
100.
that's right. Had it gone the other way round, I would have got a bill in China.
Mm,
Um, and so I like that. I like that provision.
yeah.
And obviously, our other grandchildren go to school in Northern Ireland. They start earlier than we do on the mainland, so they were there last week. So and those teachers have to be paid, and equipment, buildings, all the rest of it. We've had this rack concrete issue, haven't we, in the last couple of years on the
Hmm.
mainland, and in East Anglia is one of the areas hit hardest because they were built with this concrete. I'm told other parts of the world everything was this concrete, so it's a problem. It's a potential disaster waiting to happen. But at least we've not had schools collapse with children in them, which has happened elsewhere in the world. But again, the renewal, the repair, the replacement of school buildings, hospital buildings, all of that has to be paid for. And for me, the logic is it's paid from reasonably high taxation. Now, obviously, it's got to be managed properly,
I think
and there's whole issues around that.
it's fair to say that even if Labour at the next budget do end up putting some tax up, it's probably not going to be anywhere near as high as what it is in Scandinavia anyway.
No,
I was in Norway not long ago, and I was chatting to a few people there, and they said to me that, and again, you don't know their political motives, but the guy was from over here actually, but he's lived over there for 16 years, and he said that their NHS has. I always call everybody else's health service the NHS, but their version of the NHS has its own problems, and they've got very high tax, and people still moan about potholes, and I wonder if that's just a perpetual problem that all countries have. They have probably 10% of the cars that the UK has on the road. So I don't know. I just think what people want to see in this country, I think maybe I'm wrong, but if the taxes do go up as much as they say, will all the services get better? Because one of the arguments at the moment is, I've had great service from the NHS. My son, when he was 11 months old, had a heart operation. Again, when it was done, nobody said, "Here's your bill, sir." Again, we are very blessed. But I do think that there is a portion of people that just feel like they can't see their GP, the road's a mess, it's breaking their car. They're nothing. So I think if tax is going to be higher, people also want to see services tuned up really fast. I think this is, and I think this is we're talking about this because VAT, from what I know, is probably the highest earning tax for the UK government. And that goes to a lot of what we're talking about: hospitals. It goes to schools. It all gets filtered down to the right departments. And I think when we talk about change, one argument is that we've not. And when I say we, I don't mean me and you. I mean lots of other people that know better and have big departments behind this haven't showed the Treasury or HMRC a way to make it either neutral or better, because if it's not going to fill up the coffers, no one's going to do it. Like you said earlier, everyone after Brexit, everyone's ringing me and saying we want this scrapping, but no one, so that's another reason why the government's not going to want to take a big leap on this either.
So, little correction: VAT is not the biggest earner.
Oh, is it not? Go on.
Income tax, NI, and corporation tax, I think, are the ones.
Are they the top three? Okay.
Yeah. So it's less than 20% of government revenue is VAT.
I always assumed it was the biggest.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
In fact, I'd looked at some stats earlier. Until the 80s, it was less than 10% of revenue. And then I guess with it going, the salary rate going up to 15%, it moved to about 15%. I think it's about 15% of national revenue.
That's interesting.
So again, it's a big picture conversation, isn't it? Should you load taxation on earnings or expenditure?
I sort of think, but this just fits my lifestyle. Yeah. I think that if it's higher on expenditure, let people earn through their wages. I think that should be they've worked hard. In my mind, as a 40-year-old person, I'd rather someone just left my wages alone. I'm self-employed anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But whereas if I then choose to go spend it on all these value-added products, then tax me, do what you've got to do. Because that was a choice. And I think no one chooses to go to work every day. That should be a basic requirement.
Yeah.
So maybe that's my way of simplifying it somewhat.
Yeah. And that, that's, to be fair, that's the sort of traditional right-wing view, whereas the left-wing view would be, let's tax income higher and tax expenditure lower.
Does that promote saving, though?
Yeah, but that's the sort of, Mrs. Thatcher, that was the part of the logic of Mrs. Thatcher, saying, oh, look, we're going to load taxation onto what you spend. And that was part of the logic. Obviously, no Labour government since has halved that, because then you've got to increase, income tax to compensate, and that's people don't like that. Yeah. Again, so it's a lot of it's perception, isn't it? And as you say, you look at your wage packet, you think, wow, they've taken a lot of that. You've got to sell a limb to get an Oasis ticket, but it's worse if you pay, PAYE and NI, and and even obviously self-employed people, you still get to the end of the year, and wow, there's a big hit there.
My nephew, he comes over to our warehouse one day and he's like, oh, I need to ask you something. I say, go on. Then he gives me his wage slip. He's like, I think there's a problem with my wage slip. I've tried ringing, who was it? ACAS and so on. And I was like, pass it here, let's have a look. So I put all the code in online. I was like, no, it's right. Because no, it can't be right. Look how much they're taking. And I was like, mate, welcome to adulthood. This is why adults are so grumpy. And he was like, but I don't get it. He goes, I worked all the week and that's all I've got. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, and I do think that's why I think I'm a real firm believer that, have a light touch on people's wages, and then go do what you got to do on other things. If they choose to go buy a 100-inch TV, you know what, tax it. If they all these consumable goods, do what you got to do there. And I think you can't have both. I don't think so. But mate, Les, it's been absolutely brilliant. And you've basically said that you're coming on for a second episode. So you've let's do
that. We've got lots of stuff that we've talked about in email. So,
and I think also people listening to this, it might get us a few questions from those as well. So
if people have questions, ping them
to me, of course.
And we can see, and will we do that? I mean, certainly in our sort of pre-conversation before the summer and our emails, there's all sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so especially on, let's look at the investigation side, the assurance side, and because I sit on the Tax Tribunal, I can talk about how that would work as well. So there's lots of other things to go to, and hopefully people will enjoy listening to VAT. And why wouldn't you?
Exactly. Why wouldn't you? So, well, a lot of people say the VAT aspect of their business is like having a business partner. So actually, they should be listening to this. They should be reading up on it, and hopefully it helps them. But I've enjoyed talking to you today, Les. Thank you for your time,
brilliant, mate. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Okay, speak soon. See you soon. Bye-bye now.